David Goes to School by David Shannon. David Shannon is one of my favorite authors. I also love his book called Know David. It's a super fun read. David Goes to School is a great book to develop your classroom rules. When I read this story, I like to first show the children the cover of the book and say the setting is when and where the story takes place. And then I'll ask, where do you think the story takes place? If they seem stuck, I'll offer some scaffolding questions like, do you think he's in his bedroom, in the park, at the beach, and etc. Regardless of their responses, don't validate their answers. The objective is to get the students to discuss how they got to their answer. You can ask follow-up questions like, what makes you think that? To encourage them to think about their own thinking. After this brief discussion, I read the title of the book, and that in itself confirms or disproves their ideas. Next, I introduce the title page by teaching them that the title page has the title of the story. When you're reading the title of the story, always point under the words that you're reading so that the students have many opportunities to see that left to right progression of reading. Now, in this book, you will notice that there are no page numbers. So when I describe the stopping points, I will describe them by the words and pictures that are on the page. As with any read aloud, I recommend writing your discussion questions and any possible supporting follow-up questions on post-its and placing those post-its in the relevant pages that you wish to discuss. You could essentially choose to discuss every page in this book, but to limit the amount of time students have to sit and pay attention, it's important to intentionally plan and prepare discussion questions just for the topics you want to focus on. I'm focusing on only 5 pages because I don't want to have more than 5 rules to display. I also think 5 pages could still be a lot depending on the interest and the stamina of your students. However, don't feel the need to cut the discussions short because you want to get to discuss all 5 pages. If the kids are engaged and they're happily discussing and are interested in the topic, you can talk about it as long as it takes. When you notice students are losing interest or getting antsy, you can pause and return to the story at a later time. Getting back to the story, the first page I use to discuss is actually the first page in the book, where it says, David's teacher always said, "No, David, no yelling, no pushing, no running in the halls." The goal of this page is to come up with the first rule, which is we walk. We want this rule to come from them. We want all of the rules to come from the students. We can ask questions like, why do you think David's teacher said no running? What could happen if you run in the classroom? What should David do instead? So these are questions that will help elicit the response, David should walk. When students come up with this response, over-exaggerate this idea. Say something like, oh my, this is such a wonderful idea. It's so important to remember. Let's make a list of these ideas that you came up with so we don't forget them. Then, on the chart paper, write down number 1. This will be rule number 1. We walk. Sound it out as you write it. Then you can move on to the next page. On the next page, it reads, David, you are tardy. This is not my discussion page, but tardy is a word your students might not know. So it's important to kind of give a quick, kid-friendly definition before moving on. You can say something like, tardy is another way of saying you're late. The following page says, sit down, David, and shows David standing up and acting goofy. On this page, I choose to not read the words, sit down, David. I dive directly into the discussion by directing students to look at the picture and asking them questions like, do you think David's being a good listener? How do you know? Why is listening important? What can we do when someone else is talking? These questions are to elicit the response, we listen, as our second rule. And just like the first rule, when your students come up with a desired response, exaggerate, exaggerate, exaggerate. Make them feel really special for coming up with these rules on their own. Just like rule number 1, write rule number 2 underneath. We listen. The next page that I'll be using as a stopping point reads, raise your hand, David. This is a great stopping point because we want our kids to learn to raise their hand before they speak. To get the discussion rolling, first, I model thinking aloud. I do this by saying, look at the little girl's face. She doesn't look happy. She has her hand raised and is waiting for her turn to talk. But look at David. What is he doing? Do you think he waited and raised his hand to talk? What should he do instead? What can we do when we want to speak? What would happen if everyone spoke at the same time? Again, just like you did with rule number 1 and rule number 2 and all the rules students come up with, exaggerate and emphasize that they came up with a great idea and write it down as rule number 3. We raise our hand before we speak. The next page we will discuss is the one that shows kids in line for lunch. On this page, I start by reading, "Wait your turn, David." Then I ask questions like, "What do you think is happening in this picture? Look at the faces of the kids in line. Do they look happy? Why do you think that?" The goal is to elicit the response, "We take turns," or "We wait for our turn," for rule number 4. The last page we will discuss says, "David, have you finished?" and shows the classroom cleaned up with the desktops sparkling. On this page, I read it first. Then I say something like, "Oh, look at that, the desks are sparkling. What do you think David did? How do you know? Was that a good idea? Is it something we should do?" The goal is to elicit the response for the last rule, "We clean up." After I write down the last rule, I finish reading the rest of the book without any other discussions. At the end of the book, I ask my students to share with each other, then with the class, if and why they liked or disliked the story. Then I will share that I like this book a lot because it helped them come up with some super ideas for our classroom rules. And that later we can find a special spot for it in our classroom where we can see it all the time. If you're interested in hearing about and seeing pictures of the follow-up lesson, you can watch our next video titled "David Goes to School Follow-Up Activity." I hope you liked this video and found it beneficial. There's a written version of this lesson plan that you can download for free, aligned with Common Core state standards at teachersrock.com. If you'd like to watch more videos about lessons you can implement, subscribe and look out for videos with the subheading Informational. Thanks for watching Lessons from Teachers That Rock.